On August 20, 1944, over the skies of Japan, First Lieutenant Takuji Ono of the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force made a decision that should have killed him. At 400 miles per hour, he deliberately rammed his Kawasaki Ki-45 fighter into a massive B-29 Superfortress. The collision tore off his right wing, sent his aircraft into an uncontrollable spin, and by all laws of physics and probability, should have been his last moment on Earth. But Ono survived. Then, incredibly, he did it again, and again. By war's end, he had successfully rammed 7 American bombers and lived to tell about each collision, making him perhaps the most successful practitioner of a tactic that was supposed to be suicidal. The story of deliberate aerial ramming in the Japanese military is often confused with kamikaze attacks, but they were fundamentally different. Kamikaze pilots intended to die, turning their aircraft into guided missiles. Ramming attacks, called Taiatari in Japanese, were meant to be survivable, at least theoretically. The pilot would aim to clip the enemy bomber's tail or wing with his own wing or propeller, then attempt to bail out or land his damaged fighter. In practice, survival rates were extremely low, except for Takuji Ono, who seemed to defy death itself. To understand why Japanese pilots resorted to ramming attacks, you must first understand the crisis posed by the B-29 Superfortress. When these bombers appeared over Japan in 1944, they represented a technological leap that rendered most Japanese defenses obsolete. Flying at 30,000 feet, higher than most Japanese fighters could effectively operate, with pressurized cabins allowing crews to function normally at altitude, and carrying 20,000 pounds of bombs, each B-29 was a flying fortress in the truest sense. The B-29's defensive armament was revolutionary. It featured 4 remote-controlled turrets with twin 50-caliber machine guns each, plus a tail turret with 2 50 calibers and a 20mm cannon. These weren't manually aimed like on earlier bombers. They used an analog computer system that calculated lead and bullet drop automatically. A central fire control officer could coordinate multiple turrets to focus on a single target. Japanese fighter pilots who had successfully attacked B-17 and B-24 bombers found their traditional tactics useless against this new threat. The speed differential was another problem. The B-29 cruised at 350 miles per hour at altitude, faster than many Japanese fighters could manage at 30,000 feet in the thin air. The Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar, Japan's most common army fighter in 1944, could barely reach the B-29's altitude, and when it did, it was sluggish and unmaneuverable. The newer Ki-44 Tojo could reach the altitude but struggled to catch the bombers in a tail chase. Japanese radar technology lagged far behind American systems, meaning defenders often had minimal warning before B-29 formations appeared overhead. When Japanese fighters did manage to intercept, they faced another challenge: the B-29's armored vital areas. The crew compartments were protected by armor plate, the fuel tanks were self-sealing, and the aircraft's sheer size meant it could absorb tremendous damage. Japanese pilots reported emptying their entire ammunition loads into B-29s only to watch them continue flying. The 20mm cannons carried by Japanese fighters proved inadequate against the B-29's construction. The Type 99 cannon, standard on many Japanese fighters, fired shells that often failed to penetrate the bomber's armor or do significant structural damage. Even the heavier 30mm cannons on specialized interceptors like the Ki-45 required multiple direct hits to bring down a superfortress. Japanese pilots watched in frustration as their targets shrugged off attacks that would have destroyed any other bomber. By summer 1944, conventional interception tactics were failing catastrophically. For every B-29 shot down by conventional means, Japan was losing 3 to 5 fighters. The mathematics were unsustainable. Japan had neither the industrial capacity to replace aircraft losses nor the fuel to extensively train replacement pilots. Meanwhile, American B-29 production was accelerating, with new bomber groups arriving in the Marianas monthly. Something had to change, or Japan's cities would be defenseless. The adoption of ramming tactics wasn't a sudden decision, but evolved from desperation and individual initiative. The first recorded intentional ramming of a B-29 occurred on August 20, 1944, during a raid on the steelworks at Yorita. This was Takuji Ono's first ramming attack, though he wasn't following any official doctrine. He made the decision in the heat of battle when his ammunition was exhausted. Ono later described his thought process in that moment. He had made 3 firing passes on a B-29 without visible effect. His ammunition was gone. The bomber was approaching its target, about to drop its payload on the factory where his younger brother worked. In his own words, translated from a post-war interview, "I could see the bomb bay doors beginning to open. I thought of my brother below. My aircraft was my only remaining weapon." The decision made itself. The technique Ono developed through trial and potentially fatal error became the unofficial manual for ramming attacks. The approach had to be from above and behind, diving at a steep angle to build maximum speed differential. The aim point was critical. Too far forward and you'd hit the bomber's heavily armored central fuselage. Too far back and you'd miss entirely or hit the tail guns. The sweet spot was the wing root or the junction between the wing and engine nacelle. A solid impact here could sever control cables, damage engines, or if extremely lucky, tear off a wing section. The actual moment of collision required precise timing. The attacking fighter needed to strike with its wing or propeller, not the cockpit or fuselage where the pilot sat. This meant rolling the aircraft at the last second, presenting the wing as a cutting blade. Too early a roll and you'd miss. Too late and you'd hit cockpit first, guaranteeing the pilot's death. The margin for error was measured in fractions of a second. After impact, survival depended on multiple factors. The fighter would inevitably be severely damaged. Losing a wing was common. The pilot had to maintain enough consciousness through the violent deceleration to bail out. The aircraft would usually enter an immediate spin or tumble. Centrifugal forces could pin the pilot in the cockpit. The canopy might be jammed by structural damage. Even if the pilot successfully bailed out, he faced the risk of striking debris from either aircraft or being machine-gunned by American gunners while descending in his parachute. The Japanese military's official stance on ramming evolved rapidly. Initially, commanders discouraged the practice, viewing it as a waste of pilots and aircraft. But as conventional tactics continued failing and individual pilots reported successful ramming attacks, attitudes shifted. By November 1944, the Japanese Army Air Force had created special attack units trained specifically in ramming techniques, though these were distinct from the Navy's kamikaze units. Training for ramming attacks was necessarily limited. You couldn't practice the actual collision, only the approach. Pilots trained by diving at wooden mock-ups, pulling away at the last second. They practiced rapid canopy jettison drills and memorized the exact control inputs needed to roll their aircraft for wing impact. Physical conditioning emphasized neck strength to resist G-forces and flexibility to escape damaged cockpits. Still, most pilots understood that their first ramming attack would likely be their last. The August 20th mission began like dozens of others Ono had flown. The radar station at Kanmon reported incoming B-29s at 28,000 feet, heading for the industrial complex at Yorita. Ono's squadron scrambled from Ozuki Air Base, their Ki-45 NIC twin-engine fighters clawing for altitude. The Ki-45 was one of the few Japanese fighters with the performance to effectively intercept B-29s, though even it struggled at extreme altitude. Ono's aircraft was armed with one 37mm cannon and two 20mm cannons, heavier armament than most Japanese fighters, but still marginal against the B-29. His squadron's standing orders were to target the lead bombers in each formation, hoping to disrupt the bombing accuracy of the entire group. As they climbed through 25,000 feet, Ono could see the vapor trails of the approaching formation, 12 bombers in a tight combat box, their aluminum skin glinting in the morning sun. The first interception attempt nearly ended in disaster. Ono misjudged the B-29's speed and found himself in front of the formation, facing the concentrated fire of 48 forward-firing 50 caliber machine guns. His aircraft was hit multiple times, the port engine trailing smoke. But the Ki-45 could fly on one engine, and Ono pressed his attack. He managed to loop around and approach from behind, targeting the leftmost bomber in the rear element. His first firing pass expended half his ammunition with no visible effect. The 37mm cannon jammed after 3 rounds. On his second pass, he focused on the bomber's No. 3 engine, hoping to start a fire. The 20s sparkled against the engine nacelle, but the bomber flew on undisturbed. His third pass exhausted his remaining ammunition. The bomber's tail gunner had found the range, and Ono's aircraft shuddered as 50 caliber rounds punched through his starboard wing. It was then that Ono made his fateful decision. He later recalled that time seemed to slow down as he considered his options. He could break off, return to base, claim mechanical problems. No one would blame him. His aircraft was already damaged. But below lay Yorita, and in Yorita was his brother, working in the steel mill that was about to be bombed. The equation was simple. His life weighed against his brother's and hundreds of workers. Ono pushed the control stick forward, diving from above and behind the B-29. His airspeed indicator climbed past 400 miles per hour, close to the Ki-45's maximum dive speed. The bomber grew huge in his windscreen. At the last second, he rolled right, presenting his port wing like an axe blade. The impact was tremendous. Ono's head slammed against the canopy, his vision exploding in stars. The Ki-45's wing sheared through the B-29's tail section just forward of the tail gunner position. The bomber immediately entered an uncontrollable flat spin. With its tail control surfaces gone, it was doomed. But Ono had his own problems. His port wing was gone from the midpoint outward. The Ki-45 snap-rolled violently to the left, G-forces crushing him into his seat. The centrifugal force was so intense he couldn't lift his arms to reach the canopy release. The aircraft was spinning, tumbling, falling from 28,000 feet. At 15,000 feet, the spinning suddenly stopped. The remaining wing had torn off, leaving just the fuselage falling like a bullet. This actually saved Ono's life. Without the asymmetric lift of one wing, the fuselage fell straight, and the G-forces decreased enough for him to move. He pulled the emergency canopy release. Nothing happened. The frame was twisted from the impact. Using strength born of desperation, he managed to stand up in the cockpit, bracing his back against the canopy and pushing with his legs. The canopy finally broke free. The slipstream nearly tore him from the cockpit before he could release his safety harness. When he did release it, he was sucked out immediately, tumbling in the B-29's debris field. Pieces of aluminum, some large enough to cut him in half, fell around him. He pulled his ripcord immediately, against training that said to wait for lower altitude. The parachute opened with a bone-jarring snap. As he descended, Ono watched both aircraft fall. The B-29 spun down, breaking apart, its crew unable to bail out from the violent rotation. His own Ki-45's fuselage hit the ground seconds later. He landed in a rice paddy 2 miles from Ozuki Air Base, unconscious but alive. Farmers found him and carried him to the base hospital. He had a severe concussion, 3 cracked ribs, and lacerations from debris, but he would fly again in 2 weeks. Ono's survival should have been a one-time miracle, but he proved ramming could be survivable with the right technique and incredible luck. His second ramming came just 3 weeks later, on September 10th. This time, he knew what to expect. The target was another B-29 over northern Kyushu. Having learned from his first experience, he removed his canopy before the attack, accepting the freezing wind and reduced speed in exchange for a guaranteed escape route. The second ramming was cleaner. He struck the B-29's right wing at the No. 4 engine, severing it completely. The bomber rolled over and dove vertically. Ono's Ki-45 lost most of its right wing, but maintained enough control for him to fly 15 miles toward Japanese lines before bailing out. He spent only 3 days in the hospital this time, just bruises and minor cuts from his parachute landing in a forest. His third ramming, in October, nearly killed him. He misjudged the approach angle and struck the B-29's fuselage instead of the wing. His fighter's engine was driven back into the cockpit, crushing his legs. The aircraft caught fire. Ono managed to bail out, but his parachute was partially burned. He fell the last 1,000 feet with only half a canopy, hitting the ground hard enough to break both legs. He spent 2 months in the hospital, but returned to flying duty with a permanent limp. The 4th through 7th rammings followed a pattern. Ono had become expert at the technique, able to judge precisely the angle and timing needed for a survivable collision. He preferred to attack from the high right quarter, rolling left at impact to protect his cockpit. He learned to tense his neck muscles just before collision to prevent whiplash. He wore extra padding around his head and torso. He even developed a preference for certain parachute packers, believing some packed chutes that opened more reliably after violent aircraft breakups. His 5th ramming was perhaps the most spectacular. On February 19, 1945, he attacked a B-29 that was already damaged and flying alone. Instead of his usual wing-cutting attack, he managed to ram the bomber's tail section with his propeller, chopping through the fuselage like a circular saw. The B-29 broke in half, the tail section separating completely. Ono's engine seized from the impact, but his aircraft remained largely intact. He glided 20 miles to an emergency landing at a fighter strip. By his 6th ramming in March 1945, Ono had become a legend in the Japanese Army Air Force. Pilots called him the unsinkable Ono and studied his techniques. The military produced a training film featuring his experiences. But the strain was showing. He suffered constant headaches from multiple concussions. His hands shook from nerve damage. He could barely walk without pain from his poorly healed leg fractures. His 7th and final ramming came on June 5, 1945, just 2 months before Japan's surrender. By then, Japan had almost no aviation fuel and few flyable fighters. Ono volunteered for what everyone knew would be one of the last interception missions. He rammed a B-29 over Kobe, destroying the bomber's left wing. This time, however, his luck nearly ran out. His parachute tangled with the falling debris, and he had to cut away most of the canopy lines to free himself. He landed hard on a factory roof, breaking his back. He was still in the hospital when the war ended. What made Ono different from the hundreds of other pilots who attempted ramming attacks? Post-war interviews and psychological evaluations provide insights into his unique mindset and methodology. Unlike kamikaze pilots who embraced death as a spiritual release, Ono was pragmatically determined to survive. He viewed ramming as a technical problem to be solved, not a glorious sacrifice. Ono's background as an engineer before joining the military influenced his approach. He studied American bomber construction, obtaining captured B-29 technical manuals. He calculated impact angles, studied structural weak points, and developed mathematical models for survivable collision vectors. While other pilots relied on courage and adrenaline, Ono relied on preparation and precision. He famously spent hours before each mission studying reconnaissance photos of B-29 formations, identifying which aircraft showed previous damage that might make them more vulnerable. His pre-ramming ritual became legendary among ground crews. He would personally inspect every rivet and control cable on his aircraft. He insisted on specific modifications: weakened canopy hinges for easier jettison, additional padding in the cockpit, reinforced shoulder harnesses. He wore a specially modified flight suit with extra padding at impact points, and a knife strapped to his leg for cutting tangled parachute lines. Some called him obsessive, but this attention to detail saved his life repeatedly. The psychological toll of repeated rammings was severe. Ono admitted in post-war interviews that he suffered nightmares about falling aircraft and burning men. He could name every American bomber he'd destroyed and knew that each carried 11 men. That's 77 Americans who died from his 7 successful rammings. Unlike distant combat where enemies remained abstract, ramming required getting close enough to see faces in the bomber's windows before impact. He developed coping mechanisms that sound almost mystical but were psychologically sophisticated. Before each ramming, he would enter what he called the empty mind, a state of complete emotional detachment where he became one with his aircraft. He visualized the ramming sequence hundreds of times, programming his muscle memory to react automatically. When the moment came, he claimed he felt like an observer watching his body perform practiced motions. This dissociation probably prevented the paralysis that killed many other ramming pilots who froze at the crucial moment. The physical consequences accumulated with each ramming. After his third concussion, Ono experienced persistent double vision that he hid from flight surgeons. His inner ear was damaged, affecting his balance. Ironic for a pilot who needed perfect spatial awareness. He developed a tremor in his left hand from nerve damage. By his 7th ramming, he was flying through sheer willpower, his body held together by determination and bandages. Other pilots who attempted ramming provide contrast to Ono's survival. Lieutenant Yoshio Muto successfully rammed a B-29 in December 1944, but died in the collision. Captain Kenzo Soto survived his first ramming but was paralyzed from the waist down. Sergeant Takeo Yamamoto attempted ramming 3 times. The first 2 failed to bring down the bombers, and the third killed him. Of approximately 200 recorded ramming attempts against B-29s, fewer than 10% of pilots survived even once. Ono's 7 survivals remain unprecedented. As ramming attacks became more common, both sides adapted their tactics and technology. The Americans quickly learned to recognize the warning signs of an impending ramming attack: a single fighter climbing above the formation, approaching at an unusual angle, or continuing to close despite taking hits. Gunners were instructed to concentrate fire on any fighter that seemed to be positioning for a ramming run. B-29 formations tightened their spacing to provide mutual defensive fire coverage, making it harder for ramming aircraft to approach undetected. They also developed the porcupine defense. When a ramming attack was suspected, all bombers would bank sharply in different directions, making it impossible for the attacker to predict his target's position at impact. This tactic saved numerous bombers, but required precise coordination to avoid mid-air collisions within the formation. The Japanese responded by developing specialized ramming aircraft. The Kawasaki Ki-61 was modified with a reinforced wing leading edge specifically for ramming attacks. The Nakajima Ki-44 received a solid steel ram plate on its wing. Most radically, the Japanese developed the Shinryu, Divine Dragon, a rocket-powered glider designed specifically for ramming. It would be towed to altitude, then rocket toward bombers at over 500 miles per hour. The pilot was supposed to bail out after impact, though the design made this nearly impossible. Only a few prototypes were built before war's end. Training for ramming attacks evolved from individual initiative to formalized doctrine. The Japanese Army Air Force established the Shinten, Sky Shadow, Special Attack Unit in November 1944, dedicated to ramming tactics. Unlike the Navy's kamikaze units, Shinten pilots were explicitly trained to survive their attacks. They practiced high-altitude bailouts, emergency egress from spinning aircraft, and parachute landing falls. Physical training included gymnastics to improve flexibility for escaping damaged cockpits and swimming in case of water landings. The Americans studied captured Japanese documents on ramming tactics and developed countermeasures. They experimented with explosive bolts that could jettison damaged tail sections before they caused the entire aircraft to crash. They reinforced wing attachment points and control cable runs. Most effectively, they increased fighter escort coverage, with P-51 Mustangs specifically tasked with intercepting potential rammers before they could reach the bomber formations. Intelligence played a crucial role. American codebreakers learned to recognize communications patterns that preceded ramming attacks. Japanese controllers used specific code phrases when vectoring ramming units toward bombers. By early 1945, American formations often knew ramming attacks were imminent and could prepare defensive measures. This intelligence advantage significantly reduced the success rate of ramming attempts in the war's final months. Ono's war ended not in the air but in a hospital bed. His seventh ramming on June 5, 1945, left him with a fractured spine that required months of recovery. He was still learning to walk again when Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15. The man who had destroyed 7 B-29s and survived impossible odds 7 times would never fly again. In the immediate post-war period, Ono faced potential prosecution as a war criminal. The ramming attacks, while not technically illegal under international law, were viewed by some Americans as barbaric. However, the distinction between ramming, with survival intent, and kamikaze, suicide, attacks proved legally significant. Ono was interrogated extensively but never charged. The Americans were more interested in his technical knowledge about high-altitude interception than in punishment. Ironically, Ono became valuable to the occupying forces. His detailed knowledge of B-29 vulnerabilities informed American defensive improvements during the early Cold War. He worked as a technical consultant for the U.S. Air Force, analyzing bomber defensive systems. His reports on ramming attacks influenced the design of the B-36 and B-47 bombers, which incorporated specific anti-ramming defensive measures. The psychological aftermath was complex. Ono suffered what would now be diagnosed as severe PTSD. He couldn't tolerate loud noises. Aircraft engines would trigger panic attacks. He obsessively counted objects in groups of 11, the crew size of a B-29. He kept detailed journals about each ramming, trying to process the experience of deliberately causing 77 deaths in such an intimate, violent manner. In 1952, something remarkable happened. Through the efforts of American veteran groups, Ono met several B-29 crew members who had survived bombers he'd rammed. The first meeting was with Technical Sergeant Robert McMahon, a waist gunner who'd bailed out after Ono's fourth ramming. McMahon had spent the rest of the war in a Japanese POW camp. The meeting was tense initially, but both men found unexpected common ground in their shared trauma. These meetings evolved into a regular correspondence. Ono learned the names and stories of men he'd killed. McMahon and other survivors didn't offer forgiveness. That wasn't theirs to give for their dead crewmates, but they offered understanding. They recognized Ono as a warrior who'd fought with the tools available, just as they had. This human connection helped Ono process his guilt in a way that years of meditation at Buddhist temples hadn't achieved. Ono lived until 1998, dying at age 79. He spent his post-war years as an engineer, contributing to Japan's economic miracle. He designed safety systems for commercial aircraft, perhaps finding redemption in protecting civilian air travelers. He rarely spoke publicly about his wartime experiences, but he did leave extensive written records that historians have found invaluable. Takuji Ono's 7 successful ramming attacks remain unique in aviation history. No other pilot, in any air force, survived more than 2 deliberate aircraft collisions. His story challenges our understanding of survivability in aerial combat and the limits of human determination. While the tactic itself was born from desperation and technological inequality, Ono transformed it into something approaching science. The ramming attacks of World War II influenced post-war military aviation doctrine. Both Soviet and American air forces studied ramming as a last-resort tactic during the Cold War. Soviet pilot doctrine specifically included ramming procedures through the 1980s. Several successful rammings occurred in the jet age, including the famous 1973 incident where a Soviet pilot rammed an Iranian F-4 Phantom. Modern fighter aircraft include design features, breakaway panels, reinforced cockpit frames, that trace their origins to lessons learned from World War II ramming attacks. The ethical questions raised by ramming attacks remain relevant. Is deliberately ramming an enemy aircraft fundamentally different from shooting it down? Does the pilot's survival intent matter morally, or just practically? Ono himself wrestled with these questions for decades. He maintained that ramming was simply another weapon in his arsenal, no more or less moral than guns or bombs. Critics argued that the intimate violence of ramming, literally using your aircraft as a club, crossed a line that distant combat didn't. Modern military aviation has made ramming largely obsolete. Guided missiles allow engagement at ranges that make ramming unnecessary and impractical. Electronic warfare and stealth technology have replaced the brutal simplicity of physical collision. Yet the fundamental question Ono faced, how far will you go to defend your homeland, remains eternally relevant. Today, Ono is remembered differently by different groups. To some Japanese, he represents the samurai spirit of self-sacrifice and technical mastery. To others, he's a reminder of the extremes to which wartime desperation drove ordinary men. American veterans who knew him described a quiet, thoughtful man haunted by necessary violence. Aviation historians consider him proof that even the most dangerous tactics can be survivable with enough skill, preparation, and luck. The 7 B-29s Ono destroyed would have dropped approximately 140,000 pounds of bombs on Japanese cities. By any calculus, his actions saved hundreds, perhaps thousands, of Japanese civilian lives. But 77 American airmen died in those rammed bombers. Their families received telegrams that their loved ones were missing in action, later confirmed killed. There are no clean heroes in this story, only men trapped in the machinery of total war, making impossible choices with imperfect information. What remains extraordinary is not just that Ono survived 7 rammings, but that he found a way to live with what he'd done. His post-war life, building rather than destroying, connecting with former enemies, processing trauma through engineering precision, offers its own lessons about resilience and redemption. In the end, the man who perfected the art of aerial collision spent his remaining years trying to prevent aircraft from ever colliding again.